So irrelevant or alarming or both, and I'm going to make the case, I hope, that they're both. Now, I do get that, oops, what do I point this at to make it change? That one. Thanks. That most of you no longer are part of the national delusion that this is the one diet to rule them all, that this diet is going to reduce the risk of every chronic disease known to mankind in all Americans, because that's the idea behind this. I know that for most of the folks here that choose my plate is more like lose my plate, but even those of us with alternative views on nutrition can't completely ignore our federal nutrition guidance. It not only affects every aspect of our food system, it affects our collective imagination about food. So for a while there, the only way that we could think or talk about food was in a pyramid shape. And yes, we have a paleo pyramid. So even food information that was in direct contradiction to the pyramid appeared as a pyramid. Nowadays, of course, everything that we say about food is plate-shaped. We can't think about it in any other way. So whether we agree with or not, our federal dietary guidance affects the way that we put together food and health in our brains, what shape dietary health takes, if you will. So with this key point in mind, that it does affect how we think about this, I will take you on a brief tour of the Dietary Guidelines policy process and its history, summarize the controversy behind the 2015 guidelines, outline the changes and lack thereof with those guidelines, and hopefully convince you all that the ancestral health community needs to take a leadership role in resisting the expansion of the principles that are in those new guidelines. So how did the guidelines come to be? This is the sort of the general timeline. The main thing that you need to take away from here is that although it wasn't always the case, currently there's a very big dividing line between the advisory committee report and the guidelines themselves. The report gets a lot of media attention. There's lots of public commentary. Apparently, people have the naive assumption that if they make a ruckus about it, they'll actually change the guidelines. That's seldom the case. The guidelines come out, they're written by USDA and HHS, and when they come out and they're presented to the public, they're really pretty much a done deal, although that's a little bit different this time around, which I'll talk about, but they're pretty much a yawn for the public because we can't do anything about them at this point. We can't do anything about them anyway. That's the truth. So this time when the report was being developed, this was the situation that we had. We heard a lot about how the scientists on the advisory committee weren't really being good scientists, that they were injecting their own agendas into the report, and the report wasn't really based on science. Then when the final guidelines were released and they didn't really carry the advisory report forward with their recommendation, then the politicians were accused of being in the pocket of big ag, and therefore the guidelines weren't based on science. They're both right. The truth is that science is invoked at every turn when it comes to making the dietary guidelines. We even stuck the word scientific up there in the report of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. That's a new thing, it wasn't there before, as if saying it will make it so. But we keep invoking the science as if science and truth lives in some bubble above the earth, floating around there just waiting for us to pluck its golden apples. It doesn't really work like that with dietary guidance. It's never been about the science. Dietary guidance from the beginning of dietary guidance, and I think Nick is going to talk some more about this tomorrow, that we have always used dietary guidance as a way of imposing morality, values, of putting a lid on social issues, of dealing with these. And this is what that dietary guidance is really about. So throughout history, it's been used to deal with social ills through creating food rules. And our dietary guidance is no different. So our dietary guidance emerged in the 1970s from a lot of political and social turmoil. One of the interesting things, looking back in the 70s, there's a new book out about Patty Hearst's kidnapping, and it's really fascinating. We think of the 60s as being like sort of when all the social upheaval took place. Really happened in the 70s. We had riots. We had assassination attempts. We had skyjackings. Remember those? We had Patty Hearst kidnapping and other kidnappings. We had Watergate. The Jeffrey Toobin book says that in the mid-'70s, we had 1,000 bombings a year that were based on political protests in America. That was the 70s. That's what we were coming from here. And so we had this political, this social turmoil, and then we had what I call conditions of possibility that allowed the dietary guidelines that we have to take shape. So the backdrop is Earl Butz's agricultural policies that emphasize the fence row to fence row monoculture commodity crops. But we also had an energy crisis that sent food prices skyrocketing, especially the cost of meat. So back in the 70s, Meatless Mondays were not about vegetarianism and poor fuzzy animals. They were about boycotting meat producers so that meat producers would lower their prices. Housewives were really upset about the price of meat. We also had the Surgeon General's report on smoking and health come out in '64, and this was being sort of taken up as an idea of a way of avoiding a national health insurance program, that we could get individuals to change their behaviors and then we wouldn't have to deal with it on an institutional or a governmental or federal level. We had Ansel Keys. Most of you guys are familiar with his work. So he's going, okay, we can make individuals responsible for their health by getting them to avoid horrible saturated fat. At the same time, we had food scientists who were making the products that we could replace that dangerous saturated fat with. All of these things were coming together at a time when there were famines and droughts in Africa and in Russia, and so we were hearing a lot of Malthusian rhetoric about the population exploding, we can't feed them, and that gave traction to a burgeoning environmental movement, and all of this came together, as you saw in Pete's poster, with Diet for a Small Planet that proposed that meatlessness was going to be a solution to feeding a hungry planet, to protecting the environment, and to solving our health problems. And therefore, when we had the peaceful love butterflies of meatlessness offered to the public as a way of solving all of these social ills, the flip side of that is evil meat. And meat became the scapegoat for, this is why we had all these problems. And this was a problem. So this is why the very first edition of the very first federal guidance to tell us how to protect ourselves from chronic disease through food had this statement in it: decrease consumption of meat. There's one little teeny problem with that. We didn't have any science to back it up. As McGovern himself said, we do not have absolute scientific proof that we are going to reduce the number of heart attacks or the number of people suffering from diabetes or strokes or hypertension simply by changing their diet. So the scientists were pushing back against that first edition. The meat producers, of course, were pushing back against that first edition. So when the second edition came out at the end of that same year, they had changed decreased consumption of meat to decrease consumption of animal fat, particularly saturated fat, and choose meats, poultry, and fish. So that line was changed. Michael Pollan got his knickers all in a twist about this. But this idea of environmentalism, meat, and then the validity of the science, these issues have been in our federal dietary guidance since day one, and especially the meat. So another key point that you need to take with you out of here is that although we tend to think of dietary guidelines being influenced by lobbyists, being influenced by special interest groups, including vegan and vegetarian interest groups, by funding, by scientists who have a research agenda, the truth of the matter is the biggest influence on our guidelines are, hello, previous guidelines. And the reason for this is, if you never change the guidelines, you never have to say you're sorry for giving out crappy advice in the past, right? So they don't change, and this is tough, but everybody who is involved with the guidelines knows this. So when those recommendations against saturated fat came out, the meat people got busy, and they started creating meat with less saturated fat. That's what they did. And then they could use the dietary guidelines to promote their meat with less saturated fat. Now, since it was also starting to get awkward maintaining the same dietary guidance year after year and pretending that it was based on science as science marches forward, as it always does, the USDA came out with something that they called the Nutrition Evidence Library. And the Nutrition Evidence Library was supposed to be a transparent process of evaluating the science. What it mostly was a way of controlling what questions got asked, and then what science got brought forward to answer those questions. And of course, the reason behind this was that so the answers would always come out the way that we wanted them to. So meat is still meat, and that's still problematic for a lot of people. At the same time, bad science is still bad science, and that's still problematic. So here we are in 2015, and this is the situation that we're dealing with. We used to use saturated fat to make the case against meat. We're running out of science that allows us to make that case that way. So these are the dietary guidelines. They need to say that it's not really okay to eat meat, saturated fat, meat, equal each other. So what are we gonna do? So this is where you grab a big slab of beef jerky and sit back and hang on to your seats, because this is the rollicking road to the 2015 dietary guidelines. Here they come. So in February, after months of meetings and things like that, the scientific report of the Dietary Advisory Committee comes out, and this is when the fresh manure hits the fan. It was getting more and more difficult to make the case that saturated fat, i.e. meat, caused disease, but they tried to make this case anyway, and this was one of their draft proposal recommendations. How did they do it? Well, we're just gonna ignore that sciencey, icky stuff and look at and pull in our own reports. So they ignored the Nutrition Evidence Library for the most part and relied on reports from special interest groups like the AHA to make the case against saturated fat. But just in case, here's their safety net. We're going to shift the focus, the anti-meat focus, away from diet onto sustainability and say that a dietary pattern based in plant food is going to be better for the environment. Now, I want you to notice that there's no differentiation with regards to production methods here. Okay, they're not talking about non-arable land. They're not talking about rotational grazing. They are saying plants are good, animal-based products are bad, period, exclamation point. We need to keep that in mind. So naturally enough, the folks in the Senate they were very concerned about the scientific integrity of the report, which they should have been, but also that meat part. So they wanted to extend the dietary comment period so that their stakeholders, let's make that stakeholders, to comment on the report, which eventually the USDA and HHS did come around to extending that comment deadline, like right down at the wire. They said, okay, you got another month. And then by the May deadline, they had nearly 30,000 comments, an unprecedented number of comments, including from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, my professional organization, the Professional Organization of Registered Dietitians, that suggested the Academy is saying, you don't really have enough science to make the case against saturated fat. Now, when you've got a group of dietitians, and you know how rigorous we are about our science, when you got us saying you don't have enough science to make a case, you don't have enough science. To top it off, in some emails that came out later on, this is Alice Lichtenstein, or as I like to call her, Alice Schlichtenstein, because she loves oil. This is a set of emails going back and forth amongst the committee when the report was being written, and she says, there is no magic and or data for the 10% number or the 7% number for reducing the percentage of saturated fat calories in our diet. That's the woman in charge of that recommendation. Well, this is what makes it interesting, because I think in their minds, it's kind of the same thing, right? So the Senate and our policymakers, they're still sort of annoyed about the meat thing, really, let's be honest about it. But they focus on the scientific evidence, as we are wont to do. And they come up with, this is a spending bill, that we're going to restrict the spending unless all of the dietary guideline evidence is based on grade 1 strong scientific evidence, and that all dietary guidance in the dietary guidelines is restricted to nutrition and diet. Weirdly, they want us to only talk about those things. So the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, otherwise known as Just Folks, because their committee had been disbanded for a long time since then, they get together and they send a letter and they said, we urge you to remove those 2 riders from the bill. We, the scientific advisory report writers, want to base our recommendations on things that are not based on grade 1 strong evidence science. You know, we prefer the magic science, I guess. And we want to be able to give dietary recommendations that aren't about diet. So this is the Alice in Wonderland place where we are right now. Luckily, the summer was quiet. I got to catch up on my reading and my sleep because, hello, the fall got exciting with, in September, Nina Teicholz, who's the author of The Big Fat Surprise, came out with this article in the BMJ. She had the temerity to not only question the scientific basis of the advisory report, but to suggest, heaven forfend, that some of the members of the report had some conflicts of interest. For example, we have Barbara Millen, who's the chair of the advisory committee, and she, the committee report as a whole recommended that we all take up electronic self-monitoring of our diet, our weight, our activities levels. And just by coincidence, she happens to own the trademarks to a couple of software programs that measure exactly those things. Millennium Millen, get it? See? That's like her name. So Teicholz's article, and Nina's not without some conflicts of interest on her own, but talk about a manure storm. The anti-meat folks are over here screaming about how big meat is running the show, and the meat-eating forces are over here screaming that the vegan lobbyists have gone crazy after all. And both groups are saying at the top of their lungs, the truth is out there in that bubble floating above the earth. If we can just pluck those golden apples, if someone will stand up for the science, Barbara, Nina, please, somebody. And then Rocktober. So since the first time, since their creation, the guidelines were going to get grilled. So Secretary Vilsack from USDA, Burwell from HHS were being called for congressional hearings to find out just what the hell is going on with these guidelines. So in a nifty little move on their part, right before the hearings, the night before the hearings, they dropped a blog post on the USDA HHS sites that said that we are going to get rid of the sustainability issue from the dietary guidelines. So this sort of circumvented a lot of the criticisms that they felt that they were going to face. But they still got grilled. And it was about 2.5-hour hearings. If you can't sleep one night or whatever, watch them. They're actually really a lot of fun. But they went on for about a couple of hours, and I've just distilled them down to their essence for you. So first, you have Colin Peterson of Minnesota, and he's telling Vilsack and Burwell, you have just lost your credibility with a lot of people, right? And people are flat out ignoring this stuff, right? And so that's why I say, I wonder why we're doing this. So Vilsack, who is going to defend against the irrelevance of the guidelines, he goes, even though we don't have any pictures of baby sloths on there at all, we have a lot of clicks. And people are following our guidelines because we have, a lot of clicks. So Glenn Thompson goes and asks the rather indelicate question, are Americans healthier or less healthy since these guidelines were published? Or, in the understatement question of the century, haven't these guidelines somewhat failed? And now Vilsack does something really weird. His defense against the ineffectiveness of the guidelines in 180-degree swivel from his previous remark is that the guidelines failed because, despite the clicks, Americans just aren't following them, and that's why they're ineffective. Burwell, bless her little heart, after trying to blame the obesity crisis on her mother's China, says, we are on, yes, she did, go and listen. We are on the wrong trajectory, that's true, but would it have been worse? Worse than this? Hard to see how, but. So while the mighty defenders of the guidelines are having a rough go of it, the critics weren't doing a whole lot better. If truth be told, at the beginning of October, Nina Teicholz announces a launch of her Nutrition Coalition. This is a nonprofit group advocating to build national nutrition policy on conclusive science. I admire Nina and her work, but apparently no one ever told her that there's no such thing as conclusive nutrition science. And the project was no sooner announced than they lost one of their board members over the BMJ article. Basically, she was going, you've already made up your mind, so I don't want to be a part of this play group. And then the WHO report came out, and it told us that everybody's favorite pig product was going to make us die badly. So while the vegetarians were doing their happy dance, right? We had Michael Jacobson. Georgia wanted to know if there was going to be an interpretive dance. It's late in the day, so that was the best I could do. So he is the chief of the food police and the head fussy pants at Center for Science in the Public Interest. And to sort of draw out this sort of ridiculous irony of the term science, the Center for Science in the Public Interest is opposed to anyone questioning the science. So he's written all these letters and petitions trying to get a retraction of the BMJ feature that Nina wrote, because God forbid there be something in the literature that contradicts other things in the literature. We can't have that. And let me just point out that all of these people that he got to sign, a bunch of scientists, the folks who were on the committee themselves, when a Guardian reporter came around and asked some of them if they could name any of the unscientific statements in her article, none of them could name any of them. So that's science for you. They also, he also was arguing, again, the irony of it all, the nation's health groups oppose anti-science appropriation riders designed to gut the dietary guidelines. And again, remember that these riders are calling for stronger evidence and guidelines that are limited to diet and nutrition, because they're dietary guidelines? I don't know. So he knew what was coming. He has his fingers on the political pulse, and then at the end of the year, they did pass a spending bill, and this is law, that did three things. It redefined the standard of evidence from must be based on a preponderance of evidence current at the time to something that reads like this: significant scientific agreement. I'm not really sure if this is going to change anything, because it seems like then all you would do is make sure that you put the people on the advisory committee who are going to agree with the things that you already wanted them to agree with in the first place. But it also says that they have to limit the scope to nutrition and dietary information. The most interesting piece of this is that it authorizes a National Academy of Medicine review of the guidelines process. Badly needed. So in January, okay, so it's 2016 instead of 2015, but who's counting? They come out with the actual guidelines. They skated under the first two riders, so they didn't have to use the grade 1 strong evidence, and they didn't have to limit their advice to just nutrition and diet, although they mostly did. The National Academy of Science review is underway right now, so we're going to have to wait and see how that shakes itself out. So we have the post-apocalyptic dietary guidelines. How different were they really? Come on, not very. It's the same old, eat your veggies, whole grains, fruits, fat-free and low-fat dairy, if you have to, if you must, lean meat. The new thing, oils get their own category. So these are the slick new guidelines. A few things have changed. Those ridiculous and possibly dangerous low sodium restrictions are gone. We're still limited as a population to 1 teaspoon of salt a day, folks. You might be cheering the fact that the sugar content was limited, but this is very specific. Only added sugars are limited. So sugar naturally present in things like orange juice, and it's about equivalent to the added sugars in Coca-Cola. Orange juice is good. Coca-Cola is bad. Coca-Cola doesn't care. It makes both of them. They don't care. They don't care at all. Cholesterol restrictions are gone. No, they're not. The numerical restrictions are gone, but the guidelines actually say individuals should eat as little dietary cholesterol as possible. I don't see how you could get more limiting than that. And then we saw these headlines. It's the end of the low-fat era. New guidelines abandoned the upper limit on dietary fat. Is this true? In a word, no, it's not. It's simply not. I don't know where they got that from. The lower limits have been lifted, so they were at 20%, now they're at 25%, but make no mistake about it, if you are over the age of 3, you are still limited to your calories 35% of oil, not fat. It's been that way for a decade, so there's no change there. So is red meat off the hook? It is off the hook for now. And the meat people, they're doing their little happy dance, but look, folks, it's been 35 years of us trying to get the meat out of the dietary guidelines. It's gonna happen. The folks who are really doing the happy dance, though, of course, are these folks, the food marketing, manufacturers, food science, food tech people, because you want to lower sodium? We can help you. You want that natural sweetener? We got that. You want to replace meat with plant foods? Hell, it's already trademarked. Yeah, we got it. Because the dietary guidelines, what they do better than anything else is this. If you're focused on nutrients, we can meet those nutrient requirements. Come hell or high water, we can do it. And if you think that creating guidelines that are based on whole foods would change this, you would be sadly mistaken, because we have something called whole food powders that we're gonna put in your food, and now your powdered food is whole. Okay. The really disconcerting aspect of the guidelines is this, and it doesn't get talked about much, but it's a real issue. The advisory report talked about it as a culture of health. The guidelines themselves talk about it as aligning with the dietary guidelines. What this is about is trying to get all of the organizations, businesses, your workplace, hospitals, everywhere, to influence individuals' decisions and ultimately social and cultural norms and values to align with the dietary guidelines. What they're saying is we're going to enforce your right to eat what the dietary guidelines has determined is good for you. And let me remind you folks, it's not meat. So this is the part where we should all be a little nervous, because even though we can opt out of the dietary guidelines, and we choose to for the most part, not everybody can. And a push for nationwide alignment of the DGA is going to affect everyone, possibly even you, because you're thinking policymaking, wellness efforts in workplaces, insurance premiums. We don't really know what's going to happen with those, but trust me, if they're going to align with the dietary guidelines, it is not going to be a good thing. So and it also leaves people with fewer resources, with fewer options. So that sounds very gloom and doom, and so I'm going to give you some potential ideas about big things and little things that you could do. So we have right here in our audience Mark Cucuzella, who has worked to make his farmer's market have this thing called Market Bucks, where they double food stamp benefits so that things like locally raised eggs, meat, and produce become more effective, more affordable for these folks. So that's a small scale thing that anybody can do. And then we have Jenny Callahan, who's sitting also right here. She's got this idea that since mostly the women buy the groceries, that we can change the world. So she's using her expertise as a mom and her hip retro, make a meat loaf and make it look good sort of style to get the message out to other moms that what we've been doing so far hasn't really worked. So as I end here, know that a lot of things go into the creation of our federal dietary guidelines. Nutrition science is but a small part of it. As a community, we cannot simply engage with these guidelines on the basis of science. We have to look at how they act as moral, as social values and norms. See, that's my own stopwatch. Or we're gonna end up with this. So we have monoculture crops, we're about to have monoculture nutrition, and the dietary guidelines are black and white about what's good for us and what's not good for us. And let me remind you, it isn't meat. Any questions?
Hi, the one person you didn't mention who I think was a villain in the piece was the narcissistic sociopath, or is he a sociopathic narcissist, Dr. David Katz. And he was a very big player in all of this wheedling about when he wasn't pretending to review his own books as someone else.
Right, and I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I've actually made it a personal policy not to ever, it's like Voldemort, I don't say his name, because it just feeds the beast. I'm not kidding about that. I don't write blogs about him. I don't talk about him, nothing, because it feeds the beast. It does. He's like a bad kid. Any attention is good attention. So he gets 0 from me. But thank you for bringing it up, because that was funny. Do you guys want to hear the David Katz story? Yes. Okay, so here's what happened. So he's all down Nina Teicholz's back about the BMJ article. And somebody stumbles across this author of this really crappy sci-fi book who has given a David Katz is like, oh, this is the most wonderful prose since Shakespeare, right? And they do a little more digging, and lo and behold, who wrote the book that David Katz gave the glowing review to? You'll never guess. David Katz! He reviewed his own book. Now, typically, we consider that to be a no-no. So, yeah, so that was a big Twitter storm, manure storm, but it was kind of fun. And even his own, the Yale Review sort of took him down a peg or two. So, and that was fun to watch. But yeah, it got really personal, it got really ugly, which tells you something about how emotionally laden these issues are for the people who are defenders of the Constitution, of the dietary guidelines history. Oh yeah, well, that Guardian article, yeah, she's a different beast, yeah.
Thank you, Adele. That was, I want your slide wisdom about how you make a slideshow. That was great. Really entertaining and well delivered. So I want to put in a study came out this week that children who take school lunch at, they're on a subsidized program, they get public assistance, have markedly higher BMIs and obesity than kids who bring lunches from home. And I don't know why we're surprised at this, because of course these guidelines do determine what prisoners and school children are allowed to be fed. And veterans, good point. And so I want to put in a plug for the Farm to School program nationwide, because that really does get kids to, and sometimes it even actually brings local meat to the schools, which is great. And kids don't have any problem with seeing a live cow and then eating dead meat. They don't, it's not their problem, it's their parents' problem. But it gets more vegetables out there, and it's probably our only, it's the most programmatic way I think of getting around and maybe getting schools to actually not look so much at this and not count French fries as a potato, as a vegetable, because they have to, if they're encouraged to buy something locally, it's not going to be a French fry.
Right, and it's not going to be that prepackaged processed foods, which a lot of school lunches have gone into. I have a friend who's working in education, the field of education, and she has been doing this fascinating study where they cook in the schools 1 day a week, and which means they have to start early, and you can smell the food wafting through the school on that day. And then teachers have said, it's so weird. They do it on Friday. Fridays are usually the worst day. If anybody has ever taught public school, Friday's the worst day. The kids are like, it's like they can smell that somebody cares about them and is cooking food for them, and they're happy. Yeah, and a nice. Happy kid is a good kid, yeah. So this is the kind of stuff that we need to get behind in our own communities. So thanks for bringing that up.
So I think I already know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there any chance in heck that the government is just going to abandon the idea of providing guidelines altogether?
So I'm hoping with the Academy review that, first of all, we'll get more transparency in the choice of the committee, because that first rider about it has to be scientific consensus. One of the things that happened way back when in the early history of the guidelines, and this is really just all history repeating itself. I mean, we're having the same conversations we were having 35 years ago, and nothing has been resolved. But if they put together a truly diverse committee, that committee is not going to be able to come to consensus on a lot of things. And that may be the point at which we really dial back the scale of the guidelines. And we're not going to have these micromanaging, you get a teaspoon of salt a day nonsense, because they won't be able to come to consensus on it. So that's the first thing that we need, is this transparency in the selection process of the committee itself.
I also wonder, now that I'm thinking about it, like how many physicians in clinics who actually see patients like Dr. Cucuzzella, or like, you know, Eric Thorne in Northern Virginia, or Jeff Gerber in Denver,
Or behind you, right?
or Georgia, you know, all of these MDs who actually see the patients and see that there cannot be, it's not even possible to make a blanket dietary recommendation, because what the young 28-year-old CrossFitter super healthy needs is totally different from what the 72-year-old, you know, 300-pound diabetic needs. How can you possibly even suggest that there's like a one-size-fits-all?
Well, the
you know?
guidelines, of course, they don't treat sick people, but we have classified the majority of Americans as sick, so we're not really sure who we're even talking to with the guidelines. That's how screwed up we are, okay? We don't even know who we're talking to.
I think if, like, I don't know if there's physicians like that on the committee, but that would be like, that might be a good way to get this rolling.
No, there's mostly just nutrition science, but I think you've raised an excellent point.
Yeah.
Physicians, doctors here, can we put together a lobbying day and go up to the Hill and talk? I mean, I can help make that happen.
Absolutely. Yes.
But we need clinicians, and clinicians, Amy, clinicians are busy being clinicians. I mean, that's the reality of that life, and so it's hard to get them involved in policy because they're busy fixing the world one person at a time.
So Bill Sack actually acknowledged, I asked that exact question, Amy, at the Bipartisan Policy Center, where Bill Sack was there with 3 former secretaries of agriculture, and at least he acknowledged, because my statement was, there's really 2 plates. You know, there's 75% of the population sick and 25% well, that we need to differentiate it. He acknowledged it and said, yes, that's true. You know, he didn't, you know, he had
Right.
30 seconds to reply, so I think the thought is out there. They realize that, and maybe this review that's ongoing now, the congressional appointed, you know, Academy of Science review, we'll
Right.
see what happens. I mean, it's in their hands now.
Expect a blog post on it, you know, in the future.
Do you know how long that review's gonna?
I don't know. I don't have a lot of the details. I've been watching it as the paperwork comes through, so they're putting together. It's one of these, but I think it's like those dolls. Like, they have to find a committee of nonpartisan people to put together a committee of nonpartisan people to review a committee of nonpartisan. I mean, I don't know how they're going to do that, because I don't know, because everybody who works in nutrition science, who makes their living as a nutrition scientist, has a dog in this fight. They get their funding from NIH. Every single person on the advisory committee gets funding from NIH. That's a thing. So I don't know what we're going to do about that.
Adele, is it your sense, you know, when they say that their goal is to base the new guidelines on better science, do they count nutritional epidemiology as science? Because when I reviewed even the tiniest part of the guidelines to look at meat and depression, and found that they were actually lying about the studies that they had summarized in terms of the results of the studies.
That's how we get. You know, that's how we get to the conclusions.
Exactly.
We summarize it wrong.
We have to lie because it's just not true. So, you know, I'm wondering, when I looked at the committee, I saw that, I can't remember, there were like a dozen people or something like that, and the vast majority of them were nutritional epidemiologists. I'm just curious if you know if that counts.
Yes, and here's why. Here's the rationale out of Harvard. It's the best we've got. So Walter Willett co-wrote a paper just recently, basically talking about all of the horrible things that nutrition epidemiology is, but the conclusion is it's the best that we've got. And also that nutritional trials don't necessarily answer the questions either. So this is what I'm saying. I don't know how we can reach a consensus of sound, conclusive science. We don't have it. So it's a manure storm.
Thank you.
But I will be happy to answer your question away from the microphone, although I really like the microphone.